It began with silence, not the ceremonial kind, not the polished hush of royal chambers, but a deeper quiet, the kind that comes before something ancient wakes up, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but settles over a place like fog over stone. Edinburgh had never looked more like a kingdom. The procession moved slowly through the old city, past iron railings and onlookers who weren't sure what they were witnessing. Catherine's carriage didn't carry fanfare. No trumpets, no waving, just the sound of hooves on cobblestone and the soft ripple of flags that had been folded for generations. Inside Parliament Hall, every seat was taken, but no one spoke. The weight of history had already arrived. At the center of the chamber stood King Charles III, not in his usual stoicism, but in something closer to reverence. In front of him, a single object rested beneath velvet, a crown. Not the one from Westminster, not the golden cage of English tradition. This one was smaller, older, worn with time and secrets. The crown of Scotland. It had not touched a head in over a century. Catherine stepped forward, not with royal grace, but with stillness, the kind that breaks cameras, the kind that makes silence louder. She wore no tiara, no train, just deep green silk, cinched at the waist, the color of Highland forest after rain. Her eyes scanned the room. Parliament, generals, advisors, the king. Then she bowed, not to Charles, but to the land. That was the first moment people whispered. Charles took a breath, one long enough to notice. He was holding something back. Not emotion, but understanding. This wasn't symbolic. It wasn't pageantry. It was transfer. He stepped forward, unwrapped the velvet, and lifted the crown. The room didn't move. He turned to Catherine. She didn't blink. In the spirit of unity and preservation, Charles said, and in recognition of your enduring service to both tradition and transformation, we name you. He hesitated. Sovereign Guardian of Scotland. A new title, never spoken publicly. One drafted, perhaps long before the world was ready to hear it. Then, in full view of the room of Parliament and of every camera broadcast silently outside, he placed the crown on her head. She didn't bow again. She stood, and the room, stunned, breathless, caught in the moment between old and new, rose to their feet. The applause didn't come right away. People stood, but they didn't cheer. They watched her like she wasn't just crowned, but activated, as if something in the room, something buried beneath centuries of compromise and conquest, had shifted. The crown sat light on her head, but the symbolism was heavy. A woman, not born royal, not Scottish by blood, not in the line of succession. And yet, here she was. Catherine turned to face the room. She didn't smile. She didn't perform. She simply held the weight of the moment like she was born for it, like someone who had rehearsed this in silence for years, waiting for the right mistake in history to make it necessary. King Charles stepped back. His eyes didn't look at the crown. They looked at her. For a moment, just one flicker of time, it was clear this wasn't his plan. Not entirely. He hadn't surrendered power. He'd handed off responsibility to someone who didn't need to rule from London, to someone who could do what he never could, reclaim Scotland without a war. The chamber buzzed again, not with excitement, but unease. There were members of Parliament who shifted uncomfortably. Whispers between aides. Old lords who had nodded when Charles was crowned now sat perfectly still, as if they just realized the balance of power had been altered. Catherine turned toward them. "I accept this role," she said softly, not as dominion, but as duty. Her voice was clear, sharp, Scottish in rhythm, if not in origin. "I do not come to rule over this land. I come to return what should never have been taken." The room inhaled, visibly. Outside, the broadcast rolled quietly across screens from Stirling to Glasgow to London to New York. Scotland crowns new monarch. Catherine named sovereign guardian. King Charles delegates historic power shift. Inside the palace of Holyrood House, press handlers scrambled. Was this a ceremony or a declaration? One reporter near the front tried to whisper into his mic. This wasn't in the briefing notes. It wasn't. Catherine stepped forward. The sword of state was presented to her. She placed her hand on it, not with reverence, but with resolve. Then she looked at Charles. "You once told me," she said, quietly enough that only the room could hear, "that tradition bends only when something unbreakable walks into the room." She smiled just slightly. "Let's see how far it bends." Charles didn't answer. He didn't need to, because in that moment, every person in the room understood what had just happened. This wasn't a symbolic nod to Scotland's history. It was a recalibration of power, delivered not by decree, but by presence. Catherine stepped down from the dais, the crown still resting on her head, not heavy with gold, but heavy with memory. Eyes followed her every move, not because they were told to, but because they had to. She walked with a steadiness that didn't need tradition to hold her up, and then she stopped, right at the center of the floor, between rows of seated lords and whispering ministers. "I won't pretend this role comes without risk," she said. "There are those who will question it, those who will call it ceremonial or political or theatrical." A pause. She turned slowly to look each side of the chamber in the eye. "But Scotland has long been asked to stay quiet in the name of unity. Today, I honor her by speaking." The air snapped tight. "In this role, I vow to stand for Scottish sovereignty, not by tearing down crowns, but by reminding them where they were forged." That was it. The statement. Not rebellious, but irreversible. Outside, crowds began to gather, not just royalists, but those who had never cared for pageantry. Students, academics, tradesmen, Highlanders in raincoats. They weren't there to cheer. They were there because something ancient had cracked open. In London, the Prime Minister's office issued a vague press release. An internal matter. An honorary position. A ceremonial appointment in line with His Majesty's long-standing commitment to regional representation. But it wasn't landing. Social media didn't care for subtlety. She didn't ask for it. He gave it to her. Why? Is Charles planning something else? This isn't theater. It's real. Is Scotland finally stepping out of London's shadow? At Buckingham, private advisors began redrawing strategy boards. Because this wasn't just Catherine. This was succession moving sideways. Not down a bloodline. Across a map. In the Great Hall, the king turned to leave. The ceremony was technically over. But no one rose. They waited for Catherine. And she stayed. At the center of it all. Not above the people. Among them, the doors remained open. Catherine didn't exit through them. She didn't retreat behind velvet ropes or disappear into corridors lined with portraits. She stood in the middle of the chamber as if the walls had just melted away, and something older had stepped in to replace them. The lords who once questioned her suitability now couldn't look her in the eye. A few tried to leave discreetly. Their footsteps echoed against the stone floor, the weight of their exit louder than any objection they might have voiced. And still, she stood. Across the room, a single woman rose, older, wearing the deep green tartan of her clan. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't nobility. She was a guest of the gallery, invited under quiet exception. Her eyes glistened as she nodded once to Catherine. It wasn't royal protocol. It was recognition. Catherine saw her, and for a split second, everything else faded. This wasn't about Parliament. This wasn't about power. It was about place. And return. The sword of state was still in her hand, her grip steady. A quiet reminder. This was not decorative. This was inherited burden. From the corner of the chamber, an aide moved nervously toward her. "Your Grace, would you like to return a Holyrood?" She turned slightly. "I'd like to walk." "Through the Royal Mile?" She nodded. "Through Scotland." Outside, the weather had shifted. The sun broke gently through the mist, not in grandeur but in quiet light. When she stepped through the doors, the crowd didn't cheer. They bowed. Not deeply. Not uniformly. Just enough. A hand to chest. A head slightly lowered. And then silence again. Not the kind born from command, but from understanding. Catherine moved slowly down the Royal Mile. No guards flanked her. No horses. No royal parade. Just her. The crown. The sword. The street. One by one, people emerged from corners, shops, windows. Some with flags, some with nothing but breath caught in their throats. Children tugged at their mother's sleeves. Elders wept and didn't say why. The city held its breath. Far above, in London, palace courtiers debated whether a line had just been crossed or redrawn, whether this was an accident or a move rehearsed years in advance. A journalist tweeted, "This isn't rebellion, it's reclamation." At the edge of the street, Catherine paused. A child approached, a little girl no older than 5, holding a single thistle. Catherine bent down, accepted it, and whispered something no mic picked up, but the girl smiled. Later, someone asked what she had said. She said, "Thank you for letting me return home." And just like that, Scotland felt different. Not ruled, not conquered, represented. The walk ended not with ceremony, but with silence. Catherine reached the gates of Holyrood House just as the sun dipped behind the castle ridge. The doors were open. Guards stood still, unsure if they were saluting a monarch or witnessing a transition no handbook could define. She turned once, looking back up the mile she had just walked. No cameras followed her. Not now. They didn't need to. What had happened would replay across every screen before nightfall. But the true record was written somewhere else. In the expressions of people, the murmurs in doorways, the quiet shift in posture among those who had never bowed before. Inside the palace, a fire had been lit, not a ceremonial one. An actual hearth fire, flickering in a room that hadn't been used for decades. Someone had prepared it. A message. This is your place now. She stepped inside, the crown still resting lightly against her brow. There, on a table of dark oak, was a single scroll, rolled, sealed with wax, the sigil not of England, but of Scotland. A lion rampant, outlined in gold. She broke it open. Inside, 10 names, old names, clan names, and a date weeks away. A private council, not announced, not in Westminster, not in London, in Stirling. She sat slowly, the paper still in her hands. This was not the end of the moment. This was its beginning, because in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, questions were being asked that no one wanted to voice. Why now? Why her? And most urgently, who gave the order? Because while the world watched King Charles place a crown upon Catherine's head, those closest to the throne were whispering something else, that he had only done so after receiving a letter, and signed, unsealed, delivered by hand to the gates of Windsor. A letter that read, "Give her the crown now, or lose the kingdom forever." The letter was never shown to the public, not even to Parliament. But those who had seen it, those inside the inner ring of the crown, couldn't stop talking about it behind closed doors. There was no crest, no seal, no royal signature. Just 9 words, pen in a hand no one recognized. The ink was heavy. The paper was older than it should have been. Give her the crown now, or lose the kingdom forever. Charles had read it alone, at Windsor, in the early hours before the Edinburgh summit, before the public explanation had been prepared, before Catherine had even been informed of the ceremony's true nature. He'd sat with it beside a window overlooking the garden his mother once tended. He didn't call Camilla. He didn't call William. He just sat, stone still, for nearly an hour. When he stood, his mind was already made. He summoned the transport team. He told them, send for the Scottish crown, the one in the vault. They didn't ask why, because they had seen that look before. Once, the day after the Queen's funeral, that morning in Edinburgh, Catherine had been prepared for a speech, for a minor honor, a gesture of unity, not a coronation, not a title that hadn't been spoken aloud in 100 years. When Charles revealed the crown beneath the velvet cloth, she blinked once, then again, but she hadn't refused. She hadn't hesitated, because something in her, something not quite written in blood, but written in legacy, knew this wasn't sudden. It was overdue. Now, sitting in Holyrood, with the scroll of clans before her and the letter echoing in her thoughts, she understood what had been set in motion. Scotland hadn't asked to be ruled. It had asked to be remembered. And in doing so, it had reached not for revolution, but for restoration. Outside the palace, night had fallen, but further north, Beyond Stirling, beyond the lowlands, into the high passes of Skye and Glencoe, lights flickered in places that had long stopped paying attention to politics. Shepherds, teachers, healers, elders, people whose names had never appeared in census counts, but whose stories were carried in breath, not ink. They had heard, and they were preparing. Because when Catherine arrived at Stirling in 3 weeks, it wouldn't be another royal visit. It would be a reckoning. And somewhere in London, in a room too quiet to be safe, a phone buzzed on a desk. A voice answered. She accepted it? Yes. And the people, they didn't reject her. A pause. Then it's begun. 3 days later, the ripple became a wave. The Scottish papers were cautious. Symbolic appointment. New role for Catherine. King delegates royal duties in historic move. But the tone was thin. They didn't believe what they were writing. They were filling space until someone told them what they were allowed to say. The English media, meanwhile, buried it behind cabinet reshuffles and international headlines. But on social platforms, the conversation had already burned past control. Clips from the ceremony flooded TikTok, cut with ancient Scottish ballads and glitching crown overlays. Edits appeared comparing Catherine's stillness to Boudica, to Mary Queen of Scots, to Margaret of Denmark. The comment sections were filled with words the monarchy hadn't heard in a long time. Finally, she looks like she belongs. I don't even like the royals, but this feels right. Then came the silence from the palace. No clarifying statement. No correction. And in that void, something began to form. In Stirling, the Council of the 10 Clans quietly confirmed the meeting. No live stream. No guests. No advisors from London, just tradition, stone walls, old names, and her. They had not called it a coronation, but they hadn't called it ceremonial either. Inside Holyrood, Catherine met daily with figures who did not wear crowns. Historians, linguists, matriarchs, the last native Gaelic poet of a dying dialect, a stonemason who had rebuilt half of St. Giles Cathedral and knew which stair creaked the loudest, because no one used it anymore. She listened. She didn't bring cameras. She didn't give speeches. She asked questions. And when a young Highland woman gave her a small iron brooch, handmade, carved with a forgotten family crest, Catherine placed it on her cloak and wore it to dinner. No announcement, just memory, pinned back in place. In London, William didn't speak publicly, but those close to him said he had grown quieter, more deliberate. He walked longer at night. His calls with Charles were shorter. When asked what he thought of his stepmother's new title, he only said, "She knows what she's doing." But there was tension, because the real question wasn't about symbolism. It was about succession. And across the channel, in quiet rooms in Brussels and Berlin, diplomats were beginning to ask their own questions. If Scotland recognizes her as monarch, what happens next? What does that make Charles? What does that make William? And most importantly, what does Catherine know that the rest of them don't? The train to Stirling was silent. Not empty, just reverent. Catherine rode without escort, without flashing bulbs or pressing the aisles. A single aide accompanied her, seated 2 rows back, and even they knew not to speak unless spoken to. The other passengers pretended not to notice, but every eye flicked toward her when they thought she wasn't looking. Not out of curiosity, out of reverence. She didn't wear the crown. She didn't need to. The brooch remained pinned to her left shoulder, its iron gleam a small rebellion against the polished diamonds that had once defined royal optics. She wore gray wool, flat shoes, no eyeliner, just focus. At the Stirling platform, no band waited. No red carpet. Only 12 figures standing in line, cloaked in tartans that matched no official registry. Clan heads. Elected. Inherited. Survived. They nodded. She nodded back. And then they turned, walking together toward the citadel. The council had not convened in full since the 1800s. Not like this. Not in the old hall carved into the heart of Stirling Castle. No microphones. No translators. No official minutes. It was said that in this chamber, the crown of Scotland was once hidden beneath the floorboards during occupation. that the stone underfoot had been blood-washed more than once, and that the wind could still be heard speaking in Gaelic if you stood quiet long enough. Catherine stood. She did not address them as queen. She used no titles. "I come," she said, "not to ask for favor, but for memory, not to rule Scotland, but to return part of her to herself." A silence followed. Then one voice, deep and rough, asked, "And what part do you believe was taken?" Catherine paused. Then, "Choice." That word moved through the stone like smoke. An older woman near the end of the table smiled faintly. Another man leaned forward, folding his hands. "And what happens," he asked, "when a crown in London decides this derangement is inconvenient?" Catherine's expression didn't change. "Then they'll have to decide what to do with a monarchy that no longer fits inside a border." The air didn't break. It sharpened. Across the city, someone posted a photo of Catherine's arrival. No fanfare, just boots and slush. The caption read, "No motorcade, no press, just Scotland walking in beside her." It went viral before midnight. At Balmoral, a steward lit a fire no one had ordered. He said the chimney hadn't been used since the Queen's final summer. In London, Charles requested all communications about Stirling be routed through private channels. But the next morning, every paper carried the same photo. Catherine, seated among the council. No one above, no one below. The caption was simple. Not crowned, chosen. And inside a locked drawer at Windsor, Charles reread the letter. Give her the crown now, or lose the kingdom forever. He finally noticed something he hadn't before. A faint watermark behind the ink. Not a seal, but a thistle, wrapped in flame.